Statistics, lists, barrel scraping, all things that get used to try and determine what the greatest is in Formula 1. And mostly people will just say statistics because you can't argue with those until someone beats the statistics, in which case that doesn't suit your narrative, so you then say that statistics don't count. But that's the way that Formula 1 works in the new social media era. But it is a fun debate to have, because there's been so many interesting, brilliant and dominant, cars and drivers over the years, from the 1950s all the way up until, last year actually, when we had one of the most one-sided seasons in history, and it will be debated alongside 1988 as to who had the more god-tier car, McLaren with the MP44 or Red Bull's RB19. Some will say Red Bull because it won more races in a much longer season, and some will say that the McLaren is better because it would have had a clean sweep if not for lap traffic at Monza, while the Red Bull was legitimately slower one track. The McLaren was fast at every track, even if it didn't get pole position at Silverstone. But there are other cars that can be considered. Schumacher's 2004 Ferrari, Hamilton's 2020 Mercedes, the Williams FW14B, the 2011 Red Bull, the Lotus 49 that became the blueprint for every F1 car since, the Ferrari 312T, the list continues. But it's all down to your opinion and driver and brand loyalty, really. There's no real correct answer, no matter how much you stat pad and barrel scrape. But there's one car that I think goes under the radar a little bit, in amongst your McLarens and your Ferraris and your Red Bulls and your Mercedes and the things like that, and it's a Lotus that we're going to be looking at today. Specifically, the Lotus 72, a car that Lotus thought was so good it ran for 6 seasons during the 1970s, and it's a car that Adrian Newey himself wishes that he designed. Lotus had already achieved some form of greatness with the Lotus 49, the car that brought in the Ford DFV, which might be one of the greatest engines of all time, and not just for its wins and podium stats, but simply because of the nature of the engine. It was designed as an off-the-shelf alternative to designing and building an engine of a constructor's own design, and it, along with a March chassis and Hewland gearbox, formed the plucky privateer starter pack in the 70s. But before March came along and started offering these off-the-shelf cars, privateers and have-a-go heroes at their home Grand Prix were buying Brabhams, Coopers, Lotuses and so on and whacking those DFVs in, and if the driver was good enough, he'd be moderately competitive. Colin Chapman wasn't necessarily the inventor of certain things in motorsport, but he was certainly the guy that kinda got things working. So he was like Thomas Edison and the light bulb. Edison didn't invent it, but he got it to a point where it was working. Humphrey Davy invented it, although I think that's a bit debatable, but certainly Edison made it into the light bulb that we know today. Chapman wasn't the first to use ground effect or aerodynamics, but he got it going in Formula 1. He wasn't the first to use sponsorship, but he was one of the first to reap the rewards. And so on. He also started a revolution at the Indy 500, because the year after Jim Clark won the historic 500-mile race in 1965, virtually every car that turned up in 1966 was essentially a Lotus 38 clone. The 49 was basically an evolution of the 38 that Clark won the 1965 Indy 500 in, and while at Indianapolis everybody was copying the Lotus there, meanwhile in Europe in Formula 1, everybody was trying to copy the Lotus 49 after 1967. But while the 49 was doing the business for Lotus in Formula 1, at least when it worked, because Brabham had won the championship in 1967 and Matra had won it in 1969, with Lotus only getting the double in 68, Chapman had been working on the latest in his car's evolutionary line, which would be the Lotus 63. This would be a four-wheel drive car, designed to take full advantage of the DFV's power output while being a lightweight and simple car. Like with ground effect and sponsors, Chapman wasn't the first to do this, as it had been tried as early as 1961 in Formula 1, at least at a non-championship race at Alton Park, but it was going to take what those people had done before him and just refine it a little bit. The 63 did do some running out on track. Here is Graham Hill driving the car at the 1969 Dutch Grand Prix, the Dutch National Archives once again coming in clutch for these more historic videos. I love it. The car was basically a 49, but they made it a bit more wedge-shaped as opposed to it being the cigar-shaped design of the time, and it was supposed to be the next big thing in Formula 1, with Matra and McLaren also having a crack at designing and building a four-wheel drive car. But it was a certified, official, bona fide hunk of shit. Graham did a test run and refused to drive the car any further, calling it a death trap. It was incredibly difficult to set up, and the four-wheel drive system had more holes in it than the ending of Assassin's Creed 3. Assassins can't be controlled, but Desmond, an assassin, gets controlled by a god to kill Lucy and succeeds. So they can't be controlled, except when they're controlled. GG Ubisoft. Or there's the gaping plot hole between Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1. Rebecca saw everything and knows everything, but she didn't think to tell Chris or Richard any of this when she meets up with them in the second game of those two. Anyway, the Lotus and McLaren attempts failed. Matra was actually able to score a point with their four-wheel drive attempt, Johnny Servott's Gavin taking a point at the 1969 Canadian Grand Prix. There's some pub quiz trivia for you right there. Stewart went on to take the title in 69, and Lotus finished third overall in the championship. Rindt was third despite not finishing 4 of the opening 5 rounds, and Hill was in 7th. So a mix of fragility and working on the other car? Who knows, but Lotus gonna Lotus, I guess. But this failed car did have some redeeming features, so Chapman went back to the drawing board with the best bits of this failed four-wheel drive thing and the best bits of the 49, and set about creating Lotus's new challenger. Chapman and Maurice Philippe designed the all-new Lotus 72. Like already mentioned, it was the best parts of the 49 and the best parts of the 63 merged into one car, and was one of the first Formula 1 cars built with aerodynamics firmly in mind. Other cars had seen wings added almost as afterthoughts through 68 and 69, with Lotus adding wings to the 49 in 68 and then making them lower in 69 as the rules changed. But the 72 was a complete game changer, and fans and competitors alike were looking at it and going, "Oh, we're so screwed." It was the first Formula 1 car to have the radiators mounted in these pods on the side of the car, which, just for ease of explanation, we'll call Sidepods, instead of having them in the actual nose cone of the car like everybody else had done with the sort of cigar-shaped designs that they were all going with. So it made the car a little bit more wedgy and a little bit more pointy. And it was also the first Formula 1 car to have one of these top air boxes above the driver's head, which allowed more air to get into the engine and allowed the DFV to produce a little bit more power. But those feelings went away when Lotus realised they still had some bits and pieces they needed to sort out, this being mostly to do with the suspension. The 72 had an anti-dive and anti-squat suspension setup to prevent the car pitching too far forward under braking and to prevent the nose pitching upwards under acceleration, so that the wings did their job properly. On top of this, the car had been designed alongside Firestone, and the anti-dive and anti-squat suspension was to help get the most out of the tyres, which were much softer than they'd been in previous years. The problems with the car's suspension were slowly ironed out, and it did seem to be okay until Rindt suffered brake failure at Jarama, after which he told Chapman he was never driving the 72 again, and may or may not have said something along the lines of, "If that happens to me again and I survive, I'll kill the lot of you." The car's inboard brakes had a tendency to play up, and the car was just, well, it was a Lotus, but the car was much faster than the 49 ever was, despite the wings. Thanks to the airbox helping to generate more power and the improvements to the DFV as a whole, the car was about 12 miles an hour faster in a straight line. Total power output was something in the region of 420 horsepower. Nice. Rindt kept his word for the most part, and in a 49C he won at Monaco and used it at Spa, before the reworked, again, car turned up at Zandvoort. Jochen won that race, but it had seen the fiery death of Pierre's courage, and it had knocked all the enthusiasm for racing out of Jochen, and he promised his wife Nina that if he won the championship, he'd retire from Formula 1. He was continuing to drive the 72, but he was doing so with a degree of trepidation, in the same way that some people are still booking flights with certain airlines to avoid getting on a 737 MAX. While the kinks had been ironed out, Rindt still wasn't particularly happy with the 72, with Chapman telling Motorsport magazine journalist Dennis Jenkinson, "He has lightning reflexes, is bloody quick, but he keeps telling me how to design my cars." But that was Chapman. Simplify and add lightness. And while Chapman was right that a lighter car with better power to weight is more nimble and accelerates and stops better, there are limits to how far you can take it. Innes Island, I think that's how you pronounce his name, had told him the same thing back in like 1961, 1962, and Rindt was telling Chapman that now. And the cars were now producing a lot more downforce, so the cars had to be stronger. And if that required adding weight, then so be it. But there at the Italian Grand Prix in 1970, Rindt's prophecies about the 72 became correct, in a tragic way. Because Monza had no chicanes back then, it was the ultimate top speed track, and teams went to radical lengths to ensure the top speeds were as high as they could be. Lotus removed the wings from the 72 to get it to the same top speeds that the Ferraris could hit, so it had to be done. At least, that's what they thought. But Rindt's teammate John Miles had said that the car felt horrible with the wings off, but Rindt found the car to be okay, and it was hitting around 205 miles an hour in a straight line. Rindt then suffered a brake failure in practice and crashed into a barrier where he suffered fatal injuries. Under Italian law, Chapman was investigated for manslaughter charges, but those were ultimately dropped in 1976 when it was determined that while the Lotus's brakes had failed, it was the barrier that caused Rint's death. Ickx in the Ferrari was not able to overhaul the points gap, and Rindt became Formula One's only posthumous champion. Lotus also won the constructors. Just one thing I need to mention at this point: there seems to be conflicting reports as to what happened between Jochen and Colin at that particular Grand Prix weekend. Some reports say that Jochen said, yes, take the wings off, the car's faster and it's drivable. Some say that Colin had told Jochen, I'm taking these wings off, deal with it or don't race. And the third option with these stories is that Jochen had said to Chapman, I'm not driving this car without the wings, can you get me a Lotus 49 instead? For 1971, the team brought in Emerson Fittipaldi, who had helped Lotus out by winning the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen to help secure Rint's title. Tony Rudd joined from BRM, and he set about redesigning the rear end of the car to produce more downforce so it could be a little bit more stable, because more front end over rear end makes the car rotate too much, and if you do that in a fast corner like Copse or Blanchimont, that's just going to be chaos. The suspension was also improved, but Lotus was still trying to work the car out, and Jackie Stewart once again went on to win the title. Fittipaldi came 6th, but Lotus was once again experimenting with four-wheel drive and also with gas turbine powered cars, and all of that probably didn't help matters. The gas turbine car was the 56, and it's a video that I've done in full before, so if you want to go and watch that, I will try to leave a card, but I don't think they're being shown, especially on TV. But either way, this experimental car was the 56B. Fittipaldi could only get 3 podiums over the course of the season. 21 points for the team saw them finish 5th in the constructors, chasing the tails of Tyrrell, who went on to take the drivers with Stewart and also the constructors. Fittipaldi had also been involved in a car crash mid-season that, on top of Lotus experimenting with other cars, left them low down in the standings. But for 1972, things were going to take a big turn. The car was upgraded again, and gone was the red and in was the black as the team's sponsor changed from Gold Leaf to John Player, and the cars began their long run in the iconic black and gold livery that is something that stood the test of time. What Lotus changed on the car, I don't know, but it was enough to ensure that Fittipaldi went on to win the 1972 title, and in doing so, he became the youngest champion at the time, 25 years old. The only race that Emo didn't score at was the Canadian Grand Prix, where he was 11th, but podiums galore and only 3 retirements meant he won the championship with 61 points, a good distance ahead of Stewart, Hulme and Ickx behind. He was also the only one of the 2 main Lotus drivers to score points, as his teammate David Walker could only muster a best result of 9th. Then for 1973, Chapman was able to create a dream team because he was able to bring in the Super Swede, Ronnie Peterson. The car continued to be the best car on the grid, and looking at how the 1973 season went from the opening few races, it looked like Emma would be champion again. Peterson had all the bad reliability in the opening part of the season, but then it seemed to swap in the middle, with it being Fittipaldi getting the worst reliability and Ronnie getting the wins and podiums. So while it looked like another steamrolling of the championship to start with, Stewart's consistency allowed him to take his 3rd World Championship, which he secured at the Nürburgring before withdrawing from his 100th race weekend in the wake of Sever's death. Lotus had 10 retirements between the 2 cars over the course of the season. Stewart had just 1. Lotus would persist with the 72 into the following season, despite Ferrari and McLaren, where Fittipaldi ended up in 74, coming up with more advanced designs. Ferrari also had Niki Lauda, who was going to prove to be a challenge to beat, and while persisting with the 72, in the background there would be the development of the 76, which was hoped to be the next best thing, and around £100 lighter than what had come before. But it wasn't particularly good, and in the 9 starts it made through 1974, split between Ickx and Peterson, it retired at 8 of those races, and then Peterson got 4th at the German Grand Prix. Peterson was able to win in Monaco, France and Italy, and although the 72 was still semi-competitive and Peterson was able to drag it to good results, it was clear that they needed something new. The world of Formula 1 in 1974 was vastly different to how it was in 1970. Stephen Page of the Barenaked Ladies sang the line "You're so 1990 but it's 1994" on the song Shoebox, referencing how different the fashions and such of 1994 were vastly different to how it was in 1990, and it's a line I've used to poke fun at IndyCar's attitude to change in recent months. But the fact remains that between 1970 and 1974, the tyres that the teams were using were now completely different. They had these skinny slicks on the front and these utterly massive tyres on the rear, completely different to what the 72 had first used, which were the old treaded tyres. Not only this, Lotus had swapped tyre supplier from Firestone to Goodyear, and Goodyear was using much softer rubber, softer than what Firestone was using when they first teamed up with Lotus to make the 72. Essentially, Lotus had done something similar to Toyota in 2006. The car was built for one manufacturer of tyres and was struggling to adapt to the new one. So while Lotus had been using this car, McLaren had brought the M23, which was, like the Lotus, used for several years and won 2 drivers' championships, but it was more advanced given that it was A, newer, and B, had been designed with the 1973 regulations in mind. While Lotus had been using a car that was built for the 1970 regulations, which in themselves were not too far away from the 68 or 69 regulations. Ferrari as well. They were using evolutions of the 312, but they'd completely rebuilt them as the regulations changed. At the same time, Ferrari, Brabham and McLaren were getting all the testing time with Goodyear, and that was leaving Lotus behind as well. And while the 76 had been much heavier than the 72, that was shredding the Goodyear tyres that it was being put on. So basically what they were trying to do was they were trying to run a 2013 car in 2020. That's how far they were apart. The 72 was basically a dinosaur by this point. The 72's final season would be 1975. Ickx would drag the car to a second place at Montjuic, while Peterson grabbed 4th in Monaco and 2 5ths at Austria and Watkins Glen. It's clear from the results that the car really was struggling, the other teams having made massive strides, and Ferrari and Lauda were going to be the team to beat. And the only reason the car was running in 75 is because the 76 had been such a colossal screw-up they had to start all over again. Lotus would be 7th in the constructors. A horrible season. So they brought the 77 for the 1976 season, which sounds confusing, I know, and things did improve. The fight was obviously between Hunt and Lauda, and Tyrrell had their 6-wheel acid trip, but the car was a conservative effort for Lotus and functioned purely as a stopgap until they could come up with something new and innovative that would hopefully crush the competition. For 1977, they'd stumble on something that came about because of looking at mosquito bombers from the war, and something to do with a bloke called Bernoulli or Venturi. Those guys. So the end of 1975 signalled the end of a car that when it came out was completely revolutionary. So that's something that you need to apply to the 72. It was revolutionary, which leaves only one more question. Is it really the greatest F1 car of all time? It depends on your metric. The 2020 Mercedes, the RB19, the MP44, the FW18, the FW14B and the F2004 all have better strike rates. But the 72 won 2 Drivers' Championships and 3 Constructors' Championships. No other car has won more, and it took 20 wins over the course of 6 years in service. For reference, Jackie Stewart took 27 wins and had the record when he retired in 1973. The 72 was one of, if not the first F1 car to have aero as the root of the design. It was also the first to have the radiators as sidepods instead of having them in the nose cone, and was also the first to have an airbox. And while it wasn't the first car to have torsion bar suspension, it was the first to utilise it as a weight-saving solution, versus the coils that everybody else had. You'll often see the Lotus 49 described as being the blueprint for every modern Formula 1 car, and I'm someone that's done a video on how the 49 is the blueprint of a modern Formula 1 car. But then you look at the anti-squat and anti-dive suspension of the 72, you look at the airbox, you look at the wings, and you look at everything else, and you think, well, didn't the 72 just take the Lotus 49 stuff and then take it a little bit further? Now, is it the greatest? I mean, that's going to be up for debate. You can debate that in the comments all you want. Some are going to say it's the MP44, some are going to say it's the F2004, some are going to say last year's Red Bull. But the 79 is a contender for being the most important car in Formula 1 history. And if you want to debate against that, you're going to have some pretty good arguments. And if Chapman and Lotus have got access to the stuff that Adrian Newey and co have today, who knows how good that car could have been, assuming that nobody else had any of that anyway. So then a look at arguably the most important Formula 1 car of all time, the Lotus 72. If this has given you some insight into the car and everything else that came with it, then do leave a like on this video so I know I did one of those good jobs you've heard so much about. And for more like this, get subscribed and get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the top lads at Patreon, and if you want to help support me at a more personal level, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there if you just want to buy me a coffee, and memberships for those who want to do Patreon style support but just keep it contained on YouTube. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.